Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. For the record, Chris Harvey, continuing. Mr. Ryle, I had referred to Dr. Riddle's evidence in that question that we discussed before lunch because he was involved in the development of the WSP and presumably would know what its intent was. I'm wondering, did you happen to discuss the answer to your question with him before you gave the written answers, or not?
No, I did not. I didn't discuss my written answers to the questions that were posed to me with anyone, with the exception of some that were calculations that were done by biological staff.
Yes, I see.
For the amount of fish that were on the spawning grounds. That was the input, but other than that, I didn't discuss with anyone.
I see. The document he was referring to in his answer, and I referred to in that question, was Exhibit 184, and I've asked Mr. Lunn to pull that up on the screen. This is the document that, in his view, would lead to changes in the benchmarks, in the upper benchmark. And it contains evidence which I think you said or inferred didn't exist relating to carrying capacity. At page 33, for example, if we could bring that up, Mr. Lunn. There's a section in the middle shaded green, and this is a table, as the title says, let's see, parameters priors used to estimate benchmarks for Ricker and Kalman filtered Ricker models, etc. Summary spawning capacity based on lake rearing photosynthetic rate estimates. And the work there identifies the different carrying capacities used based on SR models. The Quesnel, you'll see, is they use the figure, the authors use the figure 1 million, and the Shuswap about 1.5 million. The Quesnel figure 1 million compares with what you had in your answers as to the escapements in 2001 and 2002 of over 3 million, I think. And so I wanted to point this out to you and ask whether you appreciate that this material relating to carrying capacity and its reference to benchmarks exists in this Exhibit 184.
Yes, I recognize there's estimates of carrying capacity. My answer was that there was a lot of uncertainty in those carrying capacity estimates.
All right.
And by meaning by that is that we could look elsewhere and come up with different estimates as well. And so that's the issue really, is that there's a lot of uncertainty in those estimates.
Well, these are the best estimates that have been compiled by DFO to date, are they not?
I don't know if these are the best estimates or not. Would be a good question to pose to the authors of this paper about.
All right. Well,
and all I'm saying is there's other estimates available, and these folks would be the best ones to put that question to as far as carrying capacity.
Well, we've had evidence from Jeremy Hume, who's one of the authors. He described and discussed a paper that he had published with Short Read, I think, and others in 1996, and it appears that the carrying capacity data has been studied since and not changed. So there we have it. But I wanted to refer you to the benchmarks that are developed here, page 135 and 136 for the Quesnel. If we could go to page 135. 135, the top of the page just identifies this as being the Quesnel aggregates. And then the next page, Mr. Lund continues, and the bottom graph I'd like to look at. You see the bottom graph identifies lower and upper benchmarks, one in red, one in green. this is for the Quesnel system, and the upper benchmark is based on 80% SMSY, which is 80% of maximum sustainable yield, I think. Is that as you understand it, Dr. Ryle, Mr. Ryle?
I would assume that's what this is.
Yes. And 80% of SMY is we calculated at 717,000 spawners. Now, if someone were to ask, if someone were to do an socioeconomic analysis of the foregone harvest in 2001, I think it was, the year that there was 3.5 million spawners, you'd have to have an upper benchmark to make that calculation, would you not? Because you'd want to measure determine the number of spawners between the upper benchmark, 717,000, and the actual number of spawners, 3.5 million. You'd need that information to get going on a socioeconomic analysis of the foregone harvest, would you not?
You would need more than just those two numbers.
All right, I accept that.
And I think if we look further into this paper, you'd find that there's a range of benchmarks of what might be the upper and what might be the lower as well on Quesnel or the Quesnel system.
Yeah. Well,
so I don't think it's a matter of just saying, here is one upper benchmark. I think what's been proposed, and one of our challenges has been, is determining those, and that's why there's an ongoing scientific study on this.
I'm just dealing with the concepts, not necessarily the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
The concept to determine, well, let's put it this way. If the purpose of an upper benchmark is to determine, to make the determination that is essential for a socioeconomic analysis, you'd expect to find an upper benchmark of this sort, would you not? In other words, a fixed upper benchmark that did not change with escape run size.
That's one way of casting it, but there are other ways to cast it as well, and one could look at it as far as a harvest rate.
All
so right. I don't think it's just a matter of picking one number and saying, let's take 717,000 as what's on this page as the upper benchmark, and saying because we put more fish on the spawning ground, subtract the difference and say that's the foregone economic value.
All right.
I would say that there's other values that would need to be incorporated, and then as I've mentioned a few times, I think there's quite a bit of uncertainty in picking fixed numbers around the capacity within salmon, and hence the work around, rather than casting these as fixed numbers, it's been cast as harvest rates.
But Mr. Ryle, sometimes we have to do the best we can, and this is the work of some very talented people with a lot of expertise doing the best they could to determine carrying capacity. Is it not?
I agree with you that these are very good people and done the best they can with the information they have at hand.
Right.
I'm just saying that there's other pieces of information, and I'm not sure we've explored them all within this paper either.
Just as a matter of interest, while we're on the paper, if we could turn to page 142. Well, 141 identifies what this is. 141 is a Shuswap. You see that at the top. 142 is the equivalent graph at the bottom for the Shuswap. The 80% MSY upper benchmark line is at 1.343 million spawners. Do you see that?
I do see that.
And in 2010, the spawner level in that system was around about 8.6 million, correct?
In which year?
2010.
Yes. Well, you know, before I say yes, it was a large number, and if that's what the record is, I'm willing to accept that. But
Yes.
I don't recall it was that large, but
Yes.
regardless.
Mr. Morley, do you know whether that's the number that's come out so far?
I don't know the precise number, but that's the right order of magnitude for
Yes.
sure. It's
So in other words, if it was 8.6, my calculation is that 640% above the upper benchmark recommended here. Now, have any of you had the opportunity Now we're in early June. Have any of you had the opportunity to see the large black mass of fry that emerged and came along the beaches in April and May of this year? The progeny of that large escapement?
I have not.
Nobody else? So perhaps the only one who's seen that is our cameraman, who I understand has it on film. And I intend to ask Mr. Wallace if we can somehow get that before the commission. But at any rate, you would expect a large black mass of fry emerging last month and the month before, would you not?
Well, you know, it's an interesting question you pose, and this will go back to why there was that many fish on the spawning grounds. It was because we were trying to protect some other stocks at the same time.
Oh yes, there are trade-offs. I'll be getting to trade-offs. But let's think for a moment what happens to these fry. In June, right about now, they're going out into the deep water. They begin their summer foraging on the food web. In the fall, they can be measured by people like Jeremy Hume. They'll have to survive the winter, and there'll be obviously a large die-off. And the die-off because of some shortage of food, starvation, to put it bluntly. The survivors will get down to the open sea in about a year's time, in a half-starved state, one would assume. And we'll see the results of that in 2014. Now, I won't ask you to speculate on the results, but I've at least got the time frame right, have I not?
For when the majority of those fish will return that
Yes.
were spawned in 2010, yes.
Yes. Mr. Morley, I'd like to ask you this. Would you say that there's something seriously wrong with a system that results in 8.6 million spawners when the maximum carrying capacity is around about 1.8?
Mr. Christian, I would agree that that's a tremendous waste of economic opportunity for many people, yes.
Yes. And are you aware of any discussion in the stakeholder discussions relating to Strategy 4 where there has been a methodology put for identifying that value?
In my conversations with respect to the next stage in the FRISI process, I have requested that those kinds of evaluations form part of our deliberations. I've also requested that the exploitation rate, and we testified about this previously, but essentially the upper benchmark, as we have heard from Mr. Ryle, is really a 60% maximum exploitation rate on any population, and that we certainly, as a group of stakeholders, have asked for that approach to be relooked at and look at other alternatives, which would include some kind of maximum fixed number of spawners in any one system.
Yes.
To look at, again, analyze what the impacts of that strategy might be.
Yes.
on both the ongoing population levels as well as the potential social and economic benefits.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to ask whether any members of the panel are familiar with the harvest and escapement strategy adopted in the U.S., first of all in the Columbia River. Has anyone got a familiarity with that process?
Well, which species are you talking about? There's not too many Chinook in the Columbia.
Sockeye.
Okay, excuse me, there's not too many sockeye. I think I said Chinook. There's not too many sockeye in the Columbia River. There's a few populations, most Okanagan and Snake River.
Yes. But those populations have returned in greater numbers in 2008, in record numbers 2009 and 2010, have they not?
To the Okanagan?
To the Okanagan, but I think to the Columbia system generally.
There was a record, to my understanding, yes.
But also 2008, 2009, while the Fraser was having record low returns, correct?
That could well be as far as some of the
Yes.
stocks, yes.
Mr. Morley, are you aware of that?
Yes, that's correct. They had very strong returns.
All right. Now, we have had some evidence in this commission before about the U.S. Management system style in the Bristol Bay area. I'd like, and in one of my tabs, tab 7, I had technical report number 7. That's, I think, Mr. Lunn, you have an exhibit number for that. I'd like to turn to that. Exhibit 718. 718, I'd like to start with page 125.
Mr. Commissioner, I haven't risen before, but my friend had not provided any notice of any documents that he was going to be putting towards this panel, and he keeps putting new documents that I did not provide to our witnesses because there was no notice provided. So we're going some ways along here on this line of questioning.
I'm sorry, that was tab, I said 7, I meant tab 9 in the letter dated May 20th, 2011 to the Commission giving notice pursuant to Rule 1661, et cetera, for the evidentiary hearings.
I've been proven wrong. I apologize.
If we could look, please, at tab, page 126, we got the Bristol Bay system. Just looking briefly at page 126, the next page. In fact, I'll skip over that in the interest of time. Go straight to 141. These show examples here. The figure at the bottom describes what this is. Catch and escapement. West Side Stockyard Stocks in Bristol Bay. Light bars are catch. Dark bars escapement. And black horizontal lines represent the upper and lower bounds of the current escapement goal range. Now, if you look at that, you see they do a pretty good job of staying within their upper and lower boundary markers for those stocks. And perhaps we'll just look at the next page. Again, looks like they do a pretty good job there of keeping within their escapement ranges. And what these are and how they're based is shown at page 139. If we could go to page 139, that's back a couple pages. Towards right at the bottom of the page, just briefly, the last paragraph, that's the ADF and G, that's Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Research biologists develop biological escapement goals for individual river systems based on sustained yield or maximum sustained yield, MSY principles, using relationships between escapement levels and subsequent returns, termed stock recruitment. In 2000, BOF, etc., adopted a policy for the management of sustainable salmon fisheries, policy for the management of sustainable salmon fisheries that specifies guiding principles and protocols for the management of salmon fisheries to achieve maximum or optimum salmon production. So there it is, Mr. Ryle, that's their equivalent, it seems, of the wild salmon policy. I'd like to ask you, do you understand biological escapement goals to mean an escapement goal based on the ecosystem's carrying capacity? Mr. Ryle, or do you know that?
Are you referring to this document here? I've not read this document, yes. And I'm not familiar with how they particularly have chosen to develop escapement targets for Bristol Bay lakes, but I would say that you're comparing things that are not exactly comparable. They're quite different systems.
Yes. All right. Well, if you're not familiar, I won't ask you any more about it apart from this. I want to look at page 171, which is the comment, the conclusion by the authors of this technical paper. 171. I'm sorry. under escapement goals, yes. The first paragraph reads, currently, management goals for each, and now they're commenting about the Canadian system, for each run timing group of Fraser sockeye are defined through the FRISI process, which has employed shared decision-making techniques and a complex set of objectives and evaluation criteria. The key missing pieces from this process are: 1, clear definition of the escapement goals for each stock by cycle year, and 2, a method for integrating stock-specific goals into a management rule for each run timing group. As demonstrated in the Bristol Bay fisheries, clearly defined escapement goals are critical for providing managers with the targets needed to make fisheries management decisions and assess stock status. I want to ask the 4 members of the panel whether they agree with that statement. Mr. Morley, do you agree with that comment?
I certainly agree that in any fishery management system, you need to have clearly defined escapement goals as an underpinning of your harvest management strategy.
Yes. Mr. Young, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I'd agree as well. And I'd add that stock, in this case, applied under the wild salmon policy would be conservation unit, and that this would include the priority of meeting lower benchmarks for all CUs.
Yes. And you would agree probably that it should be ecosystem based, both upper and lower benchmarks.
Yes, although that's quite a general question, and we could probably have a fair discussion about what ecosystem based means.
Okay. I want to turn to the wild salmon policy, and I'll tell you why. Because I read the wild salmon policy as requiring DFO managers to set upper benchmarks on a carrying capacity basis, in other words, a biological basis. And I'm going to suggest, Mr. Ryle, that it's the intent of the wild salmon policy to use the upper benchmarks for the purpose of making transparent the amount of fish that could have been harvested but have been traded off for the sake of some other value. And I should say, I noticed in the document that Mr. Leadham put up, referred to the April 2011 update that referred to Strategy 4. It contained these words in one of the slides, and I think this may have been one of your slides, Mr. Ryle. Strategy 4 is largely contingent on strategies 1 to 3. Is that a fair statement, Mr. Ryle?
Important to have that information from strategies 1 through 3. I agree.
Now, I want to look at Wild Salmon Policy Strategy 1 at page 18 of Exhibit 8, I think it is. I should apologize to everyone. It's late in the week. It's a Friday, but I want to put it to the panel what the bottom left-hand paragraph is intended to mean. Because my point is that I think, Mr. Ryle, you've been misinterpreting the wild salmon policy with respect to upper benchmarks. The wording is the higher benchmark between green and amber will be established to identify. So pausing there, it's being established for a purpose. It's to identify whether harvests are greater or less than the level expected to provide on an average annual basis the maximum annual catch for a CU, given existing environmental conditions. So there's a reference to environmental conditions. There's a reference to maximum annual catch, which presumably is the same as maximum sustainable yield. And it states that the purpose of the higher benchmark is to identify whether the harvests are greater or less than that MSY benchmark. I'm interpreting that correctly, am I not, Mr. Ryle?
Well, I think you started your question was stating that I was misinterpreting, so maybe I could address that part.
Well,
so I would go on to the other side of the page, on page 18, where it provides some examples.
All right, let's do that.
And
it says
for example, One of them is a proportion of the number of spawners estimated necessary to provide maximum sustainable yield on an average annual basis. And the next bullet says an exploitation
Well,
rate.
Wait a minute, shouldn't we stop there for a moment to determine what that means?
Sure.
And it says, example, SMSY. But earlier it said a proportion of the number of spawners estimated necessary to provide maximum sustainable yield. So is it 100% or is it slightly less than 100%, such as the 80% that Grant and others came up with?
Yeah, it could be a proportion. That's
Okay.
what that's referring to, I think.
Okay. All right, you wanted to continue?
Sure. Let's go to the next one. An exploitation rate for the CU that would limit harvest based on a rate of fishing mortality rather than number of fish killed.
Yeah, so we want to look at the whole of the mortality, not just the fish that are killed by harvest.
Right. So that
All right.
example would be an exploitation rate type strategy, which is
Well,
what we have in Frizzy.
Yeah,
So
all right.
my-
That's one component. Now, I think you want to deal with the next one too, don't you?
Sure. We can deal with all of them. They were put here as examples.
Okay.
And the reason that these examples were put in this report was not to be prescriptive about picking one or the other.
No, but
It was to
read.
be prescriptive about here are some examples.
All right, but read
and
the.
they-
Sorry,
Okay.
but read the next one. It says
Okay,
the
but
number.
right before we read the next one, I was going to provide some more explanation.
All right. Sorry.
And so there's a number of examples here one could choose, and you need to match those examples up with the system that you're trying to manage.
All right.
In my earlier comment about Bristol Bay and the Fraser are quite different systems to manage. They've chosen Alaska, and I'm sure they have very good reasons for doing that, to fix in a proportion similar to the first bullet. There's been quite a body of work around the exploitation rate that's been applied within the Fraser River, and there's been peer reviews of that work that were taken by some of the authors of the paper that you were directing me towards earlier, that attended workshops and attended documents that were been scientifically peer reviewed. So I don't think it's necessarily to cast it as my misinterpretation. I think these are just some examples that the department have put in this document, the Wild Salmon Policy, that one could use to look at how you're going to choose an exploitation rate strategy. I view these as one gains more knowledge, things could change. And you were asking about whether there'd be changes to upper benchmarks and lower benchmarks. The ones that are currently used in the lower benchmarks were labeled interim benchmarks, and I'm hopeful that the paper that Ms. Grant is putting forward is going to further educate us as far as benchmarks, and at this point in time not landed on a spot. I'm also hopeful that as far as the upper benchmark goes, that we can explore along the lines that Mr. Morley has talked about, whether it should be some different number. And to me, some different number does not necessarily mean higher or lower. It needs to be exploring what the implications of that are.
The third bullet point refers to habitat. It says the number of smolts or spawners estimated to correspond with habitat capacity. That means carrying capacity, doesn't it?
Yeah, it could be the carrying capacity within the lake in this particular system, or it could be the carrying capacity within the river where the fish spawn. It could be either of those things, so that's another example that could be used. I agree.
But do you not agree with me that the intent of the upper benchmark is to set an ecosystem-based benchmark?
I'm not sure what you're encapsulating in ecosystem
Well,
benchmark, and so
well,
like my colleague Jeffrey Young, I don't know what you're referring to when you cast it that way. I don't know if it means anything or whether what your label you're putting on it.
All right, but at any rate, Grant and Holt and Hume and others apparently understand that. Would you agree with that?
I don't know.
All right. One final question before I sit down on another subject. Well, let me make this comment. You've got to, if you're going into a consultation process, you have to first set the benchmarks on a technical basis. You have to make use of the benchmarks for the purpose of doing a socioeconomic analysis, valuing foregone harvest and other things, before you get into strategy for consultation, do you not? Or else you're in the situation that Mr. Morley has described, where a whole lot of uninformed people are basically having a tea party. Is that not a fair comment?
The Appendix 2 that we talked about earlier today lays out a 5-step planning process that I think you've heard from the panel here. We think that is a good way to go. Within that 5-step process, it talks about, in step 3, identifying those indicators. So we don't want to waste time, and one of the issues that Mr. Morley raised is maybe steps 1 through 3 should be done through technical working groups that are then brought to a panel that would then focus on steps 4 and 5.
Yes. And the technical analysis would be the sort of thing that Grant, Holt, and Hume and others have done, correct?
When you say that, you're referring just to the paper. What I would take from your question is that we would be looking at those type of people that do that biological assessment, but that's only a piece of it, and
All right.
we need that biological assessment to be undertaken. I agree.
All right. So I'm not going to ask anything more about wild salmon policy because I'm run out of time, but I have one question for Mr. Morley, and that relates to the marine stewardship certification process, because I think, Mr. Morley, you've definitely got some expertise and experience in that process. We had a panel a few weeks ago, DFO Conservation and Protection section, which where we had a description of large numbers of sockeye in freezers, and an account of how difficult it is to trace those from harvest to ultimate consumer. In the certification process, is one of the essential elements that there be traceability of a commercial product back to a legal harvest?
Mr. Commissioner, there's 2 elements in terms of what would impact on this. One is that for the certification that the fishery is properly managed, there needs to be an accurate reporting of all catches so that the management agency is aware of the level of harvest and ensures that it stays within their management regime. Beyond that, once a fishery is certified, then in order for anyone to market a product that comes from a certified fishery, any company or individual that wants to sell a product and claim that it's certified needs to have a chain of custody certification also, where their systems for traceability are reviewed and ensure that they know the source of the product, and that through this chain of custody you can trace whatever product is going through their hands as having come from a fishery that was certified. So it has to be traced back to that fishery. And within British Columbia, right now in sockeye fisheries, that would be all the fisheries that have that certification would be the gillnet, seine, and troll commercial sockeye fisheries, as well as the in-river economic opportunity fisheries that are, again, set forward as a legal commercial fishery. So as long as you have a traceability system that ensures you can demonstrate to a certifier that you can trace those fish back to those fisheries, then you're authorized to attach an MSC label to that product.
Yes. And if you don't have that, it might risk your certification. Is that...
The certification itself, again, that would apply to the individual product who wants to sell the product. The certification itself is more dependent on the managing agency being able to ensure that they have an accurate reporting of all the catches.
The managing agency is DFO, of course.
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. Those were my questions.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, Mr. Eidsvik.
Good afternoon, Mr. Commissioner. Philip Eisvik, behalf of ARE Gillnetters and the BC Fisheries Coalition. Mr. Morley, perhaps I could start with yourself. We often talk about harvesting fish in a commercial fishery, and we often forget that the purpose of the harvest is not Fraser sockeye a great natural and local food source, and really what we're doing is harvesting food?
I always have to remind people that we are, in fact, in the food business, and the only reason that people are paying us to do the things we're doing is because ultimately it's going to go on someone's plate to eat.
And indeed, it's a great, healthy, wonderful thing to eat. I know you eat it yourself.
I eat a lot of sockeye myself, and it's one of certainly the most nutritious sources of protein there is.
Prior to the wild salmon policy and multi-stakeholder facilitated processes, I mean, we've long had a problem with certain weak stocks on the Fraser River, and I think of the horsefly stock. That was rebuilt pretty successfully from very, very low numbers to millions of fish over a period of 40 years without the wild salmon policy, was it not?
That's correct.
Now, if you could pick a couple of the good people out of DFO, and I'm comparing what we've done on Cultus to what we potentially could do. If you know lots of good people in DFO, if you could have gone in there tomorrow, pick a couple of good people, give them $1 million a year, would we still be dealing with the difficulties we've had in moving Cultus forward and getting that stock rebuilt?
Mr. Commissioner, in my opinion, there are 3 significant issues facing Cultus Lake right now that are very difficult to deal with. One being the freshwater survival things, where we tried to deal with things like milfoil removal and predator control and other issues in the lake. The second whole area being early upstream migration of those fish and getting parvicapsula and dying before they spawn. And the third one being poor ocean survival. I'm not sure that I could take a couple of people and spend $1 million and do anything about the first 2. The freshwater survival, I think we probably could do more than we have done, but I still think we'd be facing serious problems because of those other 2 issues that we don't seem to have a solution for now.
We would be in better shape today if we had dealt with the freshwater issues fairly aggressively rather than spending 2 or 3 years talking.
I think we could have done more, and I think that I think there's many people, and I think you heard from some of the people directly involved in the team, like Dr. Bradford and Mr. Schubert, that they felt we could have done more, and I would agree with that for sure.
Certainly still some good people in DFO that could deal with this problem.
There's many good people in DFO, yes.
Now, if we deal with Cultus, or sorry, the other red stocks in the future that are red stocks in the CU, the same way we've dealt with Cultus and some of the problems that I've talked about, what does this mean to a coastal commercial fishery?
Well, I think our approach to Cultus keeps changing, and I think fortunately it's starting to get a little bit more enlightened in some respects, that we're starting to see that in fact we can have sustainable harvests and Cultus and still see some rebuilding even at 35 or 40% exploitation rates. But if we sort of take the same approach where we identify a problem in one of these 7 systems that may be in the red list in the Fraser, which sort of span all of the run timing groups and all of the geography of the Fraser, if we take the same kind of approach and say that we have to limit exploitation to 10% on those, that I think it means essentially, and for any period of time, it means the end of fisheries in all approach areas all the way up the main stem of the Fraser, and that the only real substantial fisheries that could be undertaken would be on the spawning grounds themselves in individual systems.
I'll get to those in a minute. And the point I think you raised was interesting. Always on fishery stocks, there's some problems that are in human control, some problems that are outside of human control. And my point is, the human control problems are the ones we have to do really well because we can't control the other problems. Have I got that correct?
Well, I think by definition, if things are in human control, we can do something about them, and if they're not, we can't. So we certainly can try to understand some of the other issues better and try to learn if there might be something we can do, something more we can do about it. But clearly the ones that we know we can do something about, we should do as good a job as we can.
Mr. Saunders, and I want to bring up one of those issues to concern us is the issue of habitat. And you were familiar probably with the proposed Adams Lake development, the 150 boat marina and the 200 condo units at the mouth of the Adams Lake, or river, at the mouth of Adams River.
Sorry, you're asking me, I'm Mr. Young.
I'm sorry, Mr. Young. Jeffrey, yeah, please.
Yeah. Yes, I'm aware of that development proposal.
And it got stopped because of public pressure, basically?
That's my understanding, yeah.
Now, being an NGO, you're familiar how difficult it can be to get public involvement on all the issues, habitat issues that affect salmon, generally, and sockeye specifically. Can we rely on public pressure to keep dealing with our potential habitat concerns, or do we have to find a better way to do it?
I think the wild salmon policy is fairly clear in identifying the importance of evaluating habitat and then using that information to guide DFO's responsibilities with respect to protecting habitat for salmon.
And I guess that was my problem, is how we deal with habitat in the wild salmon policy, is it's kind of another process has been set up. And have you heard of the concept of salmon strongholds, where there's sort of like a park and development is prohibited once you've declared something critical salmon habitat? You familiar with that concept?
I'm familiar with the concept of salmon strongholds, although I think it's a bit more complex than just that simple definition, but yes.
Yeah. Would you agree with me that it's better to prohibit development in critical areas than leave it up to another process and meetings and papers and all that stuff that we've seen?
I think the wild salmon policy gives us an opportunity to evaluate habitat at a conservation unit level and identify, for example, critical habitat for conservation units, perhaps somewhat consistent with what would be required under SARA. And with that information, I think that could give DFO a strong basis for prioritizing protection of that critical habitat.
Thank you. Mr. Burrell, I just had a couple of quick questions for yourself. You were stating that we're not there, Mr. Harvey raised some question, we're not there on the amount of carrying capacity in certain lakes, and you're just not entirely confident in the science yet. Is that correct?
I said there was a lot of uncertainty in what those carrying capacity estimates are.
And I guess my question is how do you manage in the event of uncertainty? Obviously, the Salmon Commission managed in a great state of uncertainty from, say, 1940 to 1993 without all these papers and stuff. Can you explain how they successfully managed to rebuild all the runs and not bring us the kind of chaos we've seen in the last 20 years?
Well, they had quite a scientific body attached to the International Pacific Salmon Fisheries Commission that developed tools for management of sockeye that was based upon science. So they undertook quite a range of studies within the Fraser watershed that help improve their management as well.
And all those studies have been available to DFO, I guess, for the last 20 years?
They've been available to public at large.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Morley, I think it's your last chance. Maybe you might
Mr. Commissioner, would it be possible for me to add
oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
a little bit to Mr. Riles? I think one of the bigger issues we've got in front of us, despite having on these productivity issues of lakes and other things, and the impacts, the marine survival and the en route mortality that Mr. Morley referred to, and freshwater survival, these things are changing dramatically under climate change. So to expect, the uncertainty that goes along with these things are constantly changing what we're going to experience and have to deal with. So I think it's an important context to consider.
If you were managing in a state of uncertainty, one method when you're trying to deal with escapement levels is, I'm not going to double my escapement level this year. I'm going to maybe add 10%, and then I'm going to watch carefully when I see the spawner to return ratio start to decline. I'm maybe going to get a little more cautious. That's one alternative way to do it, rather than just say we're going to go from 2 million escapement this year to 5 million next cycle.
I'm not feeling I can comment on an actual in-season management strategy, but the fact that we're dealing with a time, you talked about ease of rebuilding or difficulty. I think we're rapidly moving into several upcoming decades that, regardless of what actions we take, the marine survival and the impact of climate change may see us. We're seeing fractions of the survival that we saw compared to what we saw 10 and 15 and 20 years ago. So we're just moving into a time where these fish, regardless of what we do, are seriously threatened by the changing climate. And as well, we're also in a time when the impacts, the human footprint, is continuing to increase, which we don't have a good track record in that regard.
So we've had periods of bad marine survival. 1961 comes to my mind, where we expected a whole bunch of fish and not that many sockeye came. Why is it more difficult today than then?
I think these fish are amazingly robust in terms of their ability, but you may have gone through periods of episodic impacts, like on a 1 year or a 2 year, but this is impacts that we're going to see that continually push these fish to the limits, and the en route mortality you speak of, their physiological limits, just the temperature and the implications of disease. Once you move into those areas, the implications are very difficult to know whether the fish will survive them, whether or not they've got and this speaks to the importance of maintaining the biodiversity that we've got in the system. You don't know whether or not there's enough. These fish can rapidly, how rapidly they can adapt to the conditions that they're going to experience, which are going to be under climate change, as we've already seen, are in the extreme.
Mr. Morley, as I was saying, you may be the last public commercial representative before the commission. Anything that, we got a couple of minutes here left that you want to cover off that you haven't had a chance to tell the commissioner?
Don't put me under too much pressure at all here, Phil.
I'll give you 2 minutes to sum up the history of the fishery.
Mr. Commissioner, I had several opportunities to speak up here, and as has been indicated, I haven't had counsel representing me to get out exactly the testing I may want to get out. But it's in terms of my reflection of what we're facing here is that and I'm quite fearful that in fact we are about to see some increasing pressure on Department of Fisheries and Oceans budgets in the face of government restraint and trying to balance their budget. And I'm very concerned that that in fact the nature of the task that Department of Fisheries and Oceans is being asked to do in managing this complex resource over the last 40 or so years has changed dramatically, and they are being expected to satisfy a lot more government roles than what they used to in the past. And they're a very diverse department, covering all the way from oceans planning to the Coast Guard, have increasing responsibilities as a result of treaties and court cases to do with First Nations, and that what I see having transpired over that time period is that the department's focus on their core mandate has been completely dissipated, and their management structure has evolved to be a highly complex matrix organization, which only adds to the difficulty of them coordinating what limited resources they have on their core mandate. And I guess what I would hope coming out of this is that clearly there's many people concerned about them undertaking their core mandate of managing our fisheries resources, in particular Fraser sockeye, in such a way that it not only preserves a healthy populations, but also enables the tremendous benefits that are available from the surplus that we can generate from the stocks to be enjoyed by a variety of interests. And I would really like to see there be a serious look at how they can have their mandate and organizational structure change so that they have a much more hierarchical line management responsible for the core issues of science, stock assessment, monitoring, enforcement, and developing fishing plans. And that's really what I think many people in the industry would like to see happen here.
If I could sum it up, perhaps it's get back to the basics of fishery management.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Morley, and Mr. Young. Thank you. And Mr. Rael. And thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Mr. Isaac, thank you. Ms. Gertner?
Brenda Gertner, and with me, Leah Pence for the First Nations Coalition. Mr. Commissioner, I've been allotted 1 hour. I will take 1 hour. I am wondering if you would be interested in taking the 10-minute break now and then just having me finish in that hour?
I'm very content to do that. I just don't know how much re-examination we have. I just want to find out.
I can actually check that over that 10-minute period.
Mr. Commissioner, I think Ms. Gertner is correct. We did allocate an hour to her, and we are at a point where that would eat up the balance of the time with a 10-minute break. Perhaps this is another situation where written re-examination might be acceptable.
Or not, for you and Ms. Gardner to sort it out. And I'm going to take a break now. We'll adjourn at 4, and if the two of you could sort out time available, how you want to divide that up, I think that would be the most appropriate way to complete this afternoon.
I will discuss it with Ms. Gardner.
Thank you.
Hearing will now recess for 10 minutes.